New developments are coming to light in the death of Hayden Panettiere. The 36-year-old was found unconscious in a South Carolina apartment over the weekend.
Last Sunday night in South Carolina, the actress who once captured the world as an unstoppable teenage cheerleader was facing a tragedy no television script could rewrite. At just 36, Hayden Panettiere's life had become a story of fame, pain, survival, and struggles she spent years trying to overcome. She had spent her final months finally telling the heartbreaking truth about the darkest chapters of her past and everything she hid for 30 years. And then she ran out of time to finish. A sudden tragic ending in South Carolina. On Sunday, August the 16th, 2026, the kind of news broke that stops an entire generation mid-sentence. Hayden Panettiere was gone. She was 36 years old, and if you grew up watching her save the world every week on your television screen, this is the part where you probably had to read the headline twice. Her father, Hayden Panettiere, known to nearly everyone as Skip, released a short statement calling it a tragic passing, describing his daughter as an incredible light and a force of nature who brought immeasurable love and joy to everyone who knew her, on screen and off. There was nothing performative about those words. Anyone who has ever lost a child, at any age, will recognize exactly how careful and how shattered a parent sounds when they are forcing themselves to speak in public, before they have even had time to grieve in private. Her publicist, a woman named Casey Kitchen, said something that made this whole moment feel unresolved in a way that sat uncomfortably with everyone watching. There was an investigation ongoing, she said, and the world would likely know more within a day. No cause of death was given. What multiple outlets did manage to confirm was smaller and, honestly, a little harder to sit through. The day before she died, she had flown out of Los Angeles toward South Carolina with a man named Brian Hickerson, someone the public already recognized for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with a very public and very painful history you are about to hear in full. People close to her also mentioned that she had quietly been dealing with back pain over the past year. Nobody has tied that detail to how she actually died, and nobody responsible should pretend that connection exists without real proof behind it. It is simply one of the few facts that has surfaced so far. Within hours, actress Selma Blair left a comment underneath the very last photo Hayden Panettiere ever posted, begging her not to be gone. Her memoir, released only 3 months before her death, shot straight back to the top of the bestseller charts overnight, which, if you think about it for more than a second, is one of the saddest details in this entire story. The woman who spent 3 decades hiding her pain behind interviews and magazine covers had just spent her final months explaining every piece of it in her own words, and the world only really started listening once she was already gone. The story that ended in a quiet town in South Carolina did not actually begin there. It began 3 decades earlier, in a childhood that was never really hers to keep. A reckoning she almost didn't write. In January of 2026, she posted a photo of a book cover on Instagram with a caption that reads differently now than it did then. Some stories, she wrote, are only hers to tell. The book was called This Is Me, A Reckoning, and it reached shelves on May the 19th through Grand Central Publishing. 320 pages that she had once considered giving a far harsher title, something closer to a direct confession about addiction and trauma, before eventually settling on something gentler and more hopeful sounding. She told a reporter from The Hollywood Reporter that writing the book genuinely terrified her, because she already knew exactly what would come along with it once it was out in the world. She had to make peace with that fear before she could finish a single chapter, deciding that her own story mattered more than her own comfort. That is not a small thing to admit for a woman who spent her entire adult life being told, by managers, by studios, by an industry that profits off a polished image, that comfort and likability were the whole job. Before the book even reached stores, she sat down with US Weekly and came out publicly as bisexual, admitting the only real reason it took her this long was fear of what her team and the public would think of her. If you have ever kept a part of yourself hidden out of fear that people you love or people you work with would see you differently, that particular kind of exhaustion probably sounds painfully familiar. Inside the pages, she also wrote about her mother, Leslie Vogel, who doubled as her manager for years, an arrangement that slowly blurred the line between parenting and business until Hayden herself admitted she began to feel more like a commodity than an actual daughter. She described the years covered in the memoir as lifequakes, moments that cracked her entire sense of who she was and forced her to rebuild herself from almost nothing, sometimes more than once. What she never says directly in any of those press interviews, but what becomes impossible to ignore once you already know how this story ends, is that she spent her final months publicly closing every single wound she had ever tried to hide, right before she ran out of time to actually finish healing from any of them. Long before she ever wrote a single page of that book, the damage had already started, back when she was still too young to even hold a pen properly. Fame before she could read. She was working at 11 months old, booked for commercials, before she could form a complete sentence of her own. By the time she turned 4 years old, back in 1993, she was already a regular presence on soap operas including One Life to Live and Guiding Light, a preschooler clocking in hours that would exhaust most working adults. Her mother, doubling as her manager, meant there was rarely a clear line between mom and boss. And Hayden later wrote candidly about how quickly that arrangement taught her to measure her own worth in bookings and approval, rather than anything closer to actual self-esteem. Films like Remember the Titans and Bring It On, All or Nothing, turned her into a familiar face throughout households across the country. But it was Heroes, playing a nearly indestructible cheerleader named Claire Bennett, that made her a genuine household name while she was still a teenager, quietly trying to figure out who she actually was underneath the character everyone else had fallen in love with.
We do begin tonight with new developments in the sudden death of actress Hayden Panettiere at the age of 36. The young star growing up in front of the camera, the actress best known for her roles in Remember the Titans, Heroes, and Nashville.
Then came Nashville, where she played a fragile, self-destructive country singer named Juliet Barnes, a role that mirrored her real life far closer than most people watching at home could have possibly known at the time. In a detail she did not share publicly until this year, decades after the show ended, she admitted that working alongside her co-star Connie Britton made her deeply uncomfortable in a very specific way. She was genuinely terrified that Britton would think she was trying to steal focus or attention on set, so much so that she second-guessed her own presence in scenes she had every right to be in. That kind of quiet, private insecurity, buried underneath award nominations and magazine covers, is exactly the part of celebrity life fans almost never get shown. And it is worth remembering the next time you assume someone smiling on a red carpet is actually doing fine. What almost nobody knew, until her own memoir finally forced it into daylight decades later, is what happened to her at only 18 years old, on a boat she should have never been allowed to step onto in the first place. At 18, on a yacht off the coast of France, she walked into a room that changed something in her permanently, and to this day, she still has not said out loud whose room it actually was. The man on the yacht she still will not name. In her memoir, she describes being led by someone she trusted onto a celebrity-filled super yacht off the south of France when she was only 18 years old. Inside a cabin, she found a famous man waiting for her, undressed. In a moment, she has since called one of the most disorienting experiences of her entire young life. She has hinted, carefully, that he was a very famous British singer-songwriter. But even years later, even while writing a book that was supposedly meant to hold absolutely nothing back, she has still stopped short of ever saying his name out loud. Speaking about the memory on a podcast, she tried to explain something that a lot of people who have lived through similar situations will immediately understand. Even though she genuinely believed at 18 that she was capable of making safe and healthy decisions for herself, she was not actually equipped in that moment to fully process everything happening around her. That is not weakness. That is what it looks like when a young person raised entirely inside an industry built on obedience is suddenly placed somewhere with no adult actually protecting them. For an audience who spent years watching her play a teenage superhero who could physically heal from absolutely anything, this is the exact point in her real life where the healing stopped being fiction and became something she actually had to survive. Very few people in her orbit that night chose to protect her instead of simply staying quiet, and that silence became a pattern that would end up following her for the next 2 decades. Through relationship after relationship, through motherhood, and eventually into a hospital room where she came terrifyingly close to not surviving the birth of her own daughter. 6 years after that night on the water, in a delivery room thousands of miles away, she came closer to death than most people ever will, and lived to raise a daughter who still barely knows any of this story. Knocking on death's doorstep. By the time she met Ukrainian heavyweight boxer Vladimir Klitschko, she was already a recognizable name on 2 different continents. Their relationship, which stretched on and off for nearly a full decade, eventually produced the one thing she has since called her greatest source of both joy and fear at the exact same time: a daughter named Kaya. The birth itself, back in 2014, very nearly killed her. She has described the experience since, in her own words, as knocking on death's doorstep, a phrase she chose deliberately because anything softer simply would not have been honest about what actually happened in that room. What followed was not the glow the public expected from a new mother who had spent years playing a character who could not physically die. Instead, she battled postpartum depression severe enough that when she chose to disclose it live on television back in 2015, a beauty brand she had partnered with for years quietly ended their relationship shortly afterward, almost as if her honesty about her own mind had made her instantly less marketable overnight. For a woman whose entire career had been built on being watched and adored, that quiet rejection taught her a brutal lesson about exactly which parts of herself the public and the industry were actually willing to accept. If you have ever watched someone you love struggle after having a child, smiling for family photos while privately falling apart in the next room, this particular chapter of her life is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. She later wrote that these years slowly began mirroring the storyline of Juliet Barnes, the very character she was still being paid to play on Nashville, until the line separating performance from her actual reality nearly disappeared completely. Underneath the depression, quietly and almost invisibly, something else had already taken root. Something she would not admit to the public for another 7 long years. What she was really medicating during those years was never just sadness. It was a growing addiction she managed to hide from almost everyone who loved her. The years she was falling and no one caught her. In July of 2022, she admitted publicly for the very first time that she had spent years quietly battling opioid and alcohol addiction.
That's the telling 911 dispatch call from Sunday. South Carolina police responding to an unresponsive female, later identified as the Nashville star, who long struggled with alcohol and opioid addiction.
A secret she had carried through some of the most heavily photographed years of her entire career. She later explained that alcohol had briefly calmed her nervous system in moments of panic, but because it is a depressant by nature, it slowly made everything worse over time instead of better, feeding the exact anxiety it was supposed to numb. Those same years overlapped almost exactly with her relationship with Brian Hickerson, which began around 2018 and never once followed anything close to a straight line. In May of 2019, he was arrested by the Los Angeles Police Department on suspicion of domestic violence. In February of 2020, he was arrested again, this time in Wyoming, accused of punching her in the face with a closed fist while the two of them were inside their own home. That July, Los Angeles police arrested him a 3rd time, facing 8 separate charges, including corporal injury and intimidating a witness, with prosecutors alleging the had occurred repeatedly between May of 2019 and January of 2020. She was granted a restraining order and posted publicly that she was coming forward with the full truth in the hope it would help other women recognize the same patterns inside their own relationships before it was too late for them, too. In April of 2021, Hickerson pleaded no contest to 2 felony counts of injuring a spouse or girlfriend and was sentenced to 45 days in jail, 4 years of probation, 52 mandatory domestic violence classes, and a 5-year restraining order that legally barred him from coming near her again. And yet, within a year of his release, she was seen out with him again in public. And whatever connected them clearly never fully severed, no matter how many charges or how many court dates stood between them. That single detail is exactly why it landed like a physical gut punch when reports later confirmed that Brian Hickerson was the very same man she flew to South Carolina with the day before she died. Nobody outside that plane knows what those final hours actually looked like, and this script is not going to pretend otherwise. But the history between them is real. It is documented, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than danced around. Addiction and relationship were never the only losses stacking up quietly during those years. On one ordinary February afternoon, she lost the one person who had known her longer than almost anyone else alive. The losses she never fully recovered from. On February the 19th, 2023, her younger brother, Hayden Panettiere, was found unresponsive inside his own home in Nyack, New York, after he failed to show up for a scheduled business meeting. He was 28 years old. A medical examiner later determined the cause was cardiomegaly, an enlarged heart complicated further by problems with his aortic valve, a condition that nobody around him, including Jansen himself, had ever known existed. Hayden later told People magazine that protecting her only sibling had felt like her personal job since the two of them were children, and that failing to see something like this coming broke a part of her that never fully closed back up again. In the months that followed, paparazzi photographed her leaving his intentionally private funeral, images that triggered a return of the agoraphobia she had quietly struggled with in years past, long before most fans ever knew the word applied to her at all. Her body changed, too, in ways she could not fully explain or control. She told interviewers she gained roughly 40 pounds in a remarkably short window of time, regardless of what she ate or how hard she tried to manage it, describing the weight gain as something stress and cortisol simply did to her body, rather than anything she personally chose. Layered directly underneath all of that fresh grief was a second wound the public had misunderstood for years, without ever bothering to ask her directly. The custody arrangement for her daughter Kaya, who has lived full-time in Ukraine with her father since she was only 2 years old, was painted by tabloid headlines for a long time as Hayden simply walking away from her own child without looking back. She finally corrected that story herself, explaining that it was actually Klitschko who first suggested Kaya live with him full-time, while Hayden fought through her own mental health and addiction struggles privately, and calling the entire decision the most gut-wrenching experience of her whole life, not the careless one the headlines had suggested for years. In one of her final interviews, given only a few months before she died, she admitted that Kaya had recently started expressing genuine interest in acting herself, calling the idea a nail-biter, because she, of all people on Earth, understood exactly what that particular spotlight can quietly do to a child before anyone even notices the damage happening. She spent her entire life trying to protect the people she loved most from the same industry that had raised her since before she could read. In the end, it was her own protection she ran out of time to finish. If her story stayed with you the way it stayed with us while writing this, tell us honestly which chapter hit you the hardest down in the comments below. We genuinely read every single one of them.